You've said something here where you said that video had fewer views, as if that's the metric of success. They're not attracted to the abstraction in a naked way. They're only attracted to it insofar as it's compactifying something that was already inside their mind. This could be so much better written. Like, why didn't you just like motivate your freaking definitions, or like give me one reason why I should care about this? It feels very academic of you to come at it from the side of credit. Like, oh, of course people should be motivated by credit. Like in the world of academia, like that's the primary currency.
Wait, Grant, I just
Well,
thought that everyone
well
needs to be praised for what they do to feel good about themselves. No? Hi, welcome to Math Life Balance. Today we're starting a new season of interviews with people who do math outreach, and our first guest is Grant Sanderson, creator of the incredibly popular and rightly so math YouTube channel 3 Blue 1 Brown.
Thanks for having me on. This should be fun.
So let me ask you first basic introductory questions to those who maybe don't know you very well. So what brought you into math outreach?
I mean, I've always liked teaching in some capacity, even when I was just in school and doing tutoring and things like that. Towards the end of my undergrad, I would do a few more things in the range of like talks or lectures. I remember at Stanford, there was one program where undergrad or prospective undergrads would come, like high school students, and then undergrads could teach them, an hour-long lesson on whatever they wanted. And I would have a lot of fun with that. And then at some point, I was doing this kind of side project centered around making math animations programmatically, and thought that it might be fun to make a video out of it in some capacity. Um, One thing led to another where I ended up talking with folks at Khan Academy, and I was really inspired by the work of Khan Academy at that time and kind of what they were doing for education online. I did a little bit of contracting with them, then that turned into kind of a full-time job with them. And I think once I just got a little bit more engaged with the world of online math exposition, it was clear it was something I really liked. So I just sort of kept doubling down in that direction.
And so what are your favorite parts of your job?
Well, I guess the favorite and least favorite, there's incredible freedom, right? Like I'm in a very, very fortunate position compared to, let's say, like a math teacher in a classroom where I can choose the topic that I want to put out. I can say, oh, here's the thing that really got me going. Here's the thing that I find really beautiful or inspiring for whatever reason. So that's the thing that I'm going to pour my month into. Whereas if there's a pre-existing curriculum, it might be a little bit harder to like feign that enthusiasm each time or try to backfit it to what the interests of both the teacher and the student might be. So that choice, I think, is a luxury.
Actually, I had a question related to that. So you say you're in this incredibly lucky position, but I think there is one big difficulty in your position, and I wonder how you deal with that. And that is that you are already super successful at what you do. And so is it ever, and like, how do you deal with the fact that in the way of doing math outreach, I think you have succeeded kind of as much as one could?
Well, maybe this is sort of why I was saying it's both the best and the worst thing. This is the most first world problem there could be, right? Like, oh no, there's too many people in the audience. But when there's a lot of people in the audience, there's also a strong diversity of what motivates them and where they're coming from. And I think as a result, anytime you're putting together a lesson, you want to try to empathize with the student and say, where are they coming from? What motivates them? How much do they already understand? What's their appetite? And early on, when I would play that little empathy lesson, I would have kind of a clear view of who I thought the audience was, which was more or less a copy of myself or maybe a younger version of myself. So I could know pretty well, oh, this is what motivates them. For example, I think I didn't really care as much about applicability in a very direct sense, where here's a piece of math and here's where in physics or in computer science you use it. Instead, it would be unexpected connections that would get me going. And I know that works for a lot of other people too, especially who are into pure math. As time has gone on, though, and I've done more things that are related to the actual world, where, I have a series about neural networks and I'm making videos about transformers, or I did a bunch about optics last year. I know a lot of the people who watch those or who got onto the channel because of those, it's because what makes them care about something is knowing when it touches the world, which is,
Mhm.
obviously super valid and very worth emphasizing. But then that means for any given new topic, there's this tug and pull between the different kinds of people. So that's just one divide, right? Whether you like things for their purity and unexpected connections, or whether you like to see how it approaches the world. And that determines, like, how are you going to introduce the video? What even is the topic in the first place? But there's a bunch of other divides, like, hey, is it someone who is like you, who is extremely conversant in math, and so you can assume a lot about what they might know, but you're just there to show kind of an unexpected thing? Or is it a fledgling student who maybe is a little bit less comfortable with it, and for certain ideas or topics, you want to take a little bit more time to step through without rushing through it? Um, you have just different ages, right? You know, what are the references that someone might be used to? All of these different things, as an audience grows, you end up more tugged and pulled, such that you're constantly making this choice of either compromising in the middle of all of those so that it's not really the best for any one of them, or for a given topic, doubling down on one perceived audience type, knowing full well that it's just now a much worse video for, like, people on the opposite edge of that particular population. And it's weird, and I think it results in a lot of writer's block for me.
Actually, a friend of mine once invited a sociologist to a summer school for female students who are interested in mathematics. And so that sociologist was supposed to check on how good this math outreach program is working. And there were some very interesting results. I want to make later a separate video on this and interview my friend. But in particular, the sociologist has found out that when we advertise math as saying, like, math is beautiful, that actually works pretty well for people who have higher education and maybe better income in the families. But advertising math as something useful or like applicable to the world tends to work better for people with not so high income in families. And so basically, when we advertise math in one way, in maybe a typical way, is like, math is beautiful. So we this maybe not so great for math outreach in circles that we catch up less, you know. So this was just
That's very interesting. Yeah. It makes sense, right? Like, all the aristocrats are the ones studying art, and, like, anyone in lower class is the one who cares more about, like, upward mobility.
yeah, actually. So they did. So the sociologists did more of these studies, and they later wrote a book together. So yes,
What's
there
the
is.
name of the book?
I should find out and let you know. It's in French. I'm just saying that yes, you're right to assume that different people need, and not just because of their mathematical background, but because of other reasons. People may need, different, strings to pull them. But I wanted to ask you about this, and then I heard that you asked the same question when you interviewed Stephen Strogatz. There was a similar question. So the
Okay.
question was whether you. So let's say, I don't know, you meet just one-on-one a person and you want to advertise mathematics to them. So is there anything else that you keep in mind in terms of targeting except their math background?
Well, I mean, the obvious one would be if you know that they're interested in some particular thing, like they have a passion about sports, right? Or they have a passion
Ah,
about video games or something. The more that you can connect it to that, the better you'll do. And
uh-huh.
so if you know anything about the person and you can try to connect it in some way there, like, that seems like it's obviously better. I I do sometimes think, though, when you try to make it applied in those ways, there's a strong risk of it being contrived. And we all know the examples of word problems at the end of some school textbook that just fall flat because they're really weird questions that wouldn't actually come up in the world, but they're trying to make it look like the math will be used in some certain way. And so you want to avoid that. Um, I think it's like any form of communication where I might try to start describing something that I am excited about. And then if the person's not jiving with it, then just switch, pivot in some way. And so it's maybe a little bit less about a priori, what do we know about the person, and more in the moment. If you're getting to do exposition in a one-on-one setting, you can just pivot. You can just say, like, wow, this one's not working. Like, let me try something different, and try to be pretty fluid about that, which is why, like, I really like like one-on-one kind of teaching. And I have a ton of respect for those who can do like 20-on-1 teaching effectively, because I think that's very hard to know how to navigate like a given hour-long lesson. Um, Now, all of that's of
Hmm.
course very different from just making a pre-baked like video that's supposed to be generic for a wider audience. Um, but being not being too attached to your preconception for where a lesson is going to go is maybe the thing that matters most when you actually have a positive feedback loop with a person.
I forgot to say, I mentioned the interview with Steven Stroggers because I liked it very much, and I wanted to tell everyone to watch it.
Oh, he's a gem. He's someone where you just like start talking to him, and it's always going to be a good conversation.
I liked the both parts of the conversation. Actually, so maybe a related question is, I wanted to ask you, why do you think there are so many people watching your videos? So, I mean, many more people than I would assume would be interested in mathematics. So, what do you think are the main things people get out of it?
I don't know. I think so. The visuals count for a lot. The whole premise of the channel is to visualize math and to take certain topics that otherwise might be taught purely symbolically and are
Mm-hmm.
thereby hiding a little bit of the intuition which is going on in the mathematician's head, and instead just laying it out there. I think because it takes so much, it's like a mixture of time and tooling and expertise to like make good visuals for a bit of math. Just there's less of that. There's the lower supply on the internet just because it takes a lot to make that happen. And so therefore, insofar as people have an appetite to get a more direct window into those sorts of intuitions, there's much more these days. Actually, there's quite a few good just visual online math explainers like out in the world now. But maybe 10 years ago, this was not as much the case. And I think there's more of an appetite for math than people give credit for, partly because, okay, so if we measure like who's interested in math by who majors in it or something like that, okay, it's a pretty small population. But if you say who majors in some STEM related field and kind of enjoys some of the math that comes up there, so whether they're doing computer science or physics or some flavor of engineering, like the body of people who have an appreciation for what it can feel like for math to be fun is actually much wider than the body of people who would like self-identify as, you know, liking math first and foremost. And uh, that I think is especially true outside of school, like for the people after they've graduated, the people who are working engineers out there and things like that, where they kind of miss having new things to learn in that way. And so it's nice to have something out there that can fill that void. This is part of why pop science, I think, became more of a thing in like the last several decades, where people reading books by Stephen Hawking and things like that. It's because there's an appetite to, I don't know, engage with something a little bit technical, know how the world works, whatever it might be. There's just even if it's not a large percentage of the human population, like it's a huge absolute number of people who are curious about that kind of thing. So maybe a mixture of having a style which is maybe got a high enough barrier to entry, I don't know, and then the fact that there's a lot of latent interest in math that popular media doesn't address. Like there's just not, you know, a compelling Netflix series about math or things like that.
A very important question I wanted to ask about this, which is related to my personal interest. So, as a mathematician, I do kind of math which is maybe more on the abstract side. And I used to live with this relieving / sad feeling that there is no way to visualize what we are doing. And so I never really tried to think about it, how to visualize, because I always felt that it's impossible. But then in your advice on how to do math outreach, you say that one should always at least try to think about how to visualize things. And this made me think that maybe I have oversimplified my life by saying that it's just impossible. So do you have a feeling that any kind of math could somehow be visualized? Or
Yeah, well, I think we should maybe dissect what we mean by the word visualize there, because a lot of times the first place people go is that like you're graphing something, right? I think for people outside of math, when they think, oh, you're visualizing, it's like you're graphing a function, of the engineers. But they say, okay, maybe there's lots of other ways that you make it geometric in some way. That's not necessarily like a function graph with inputs and outputs. But also visualizing like in the broadest sense of the word, just means that you're using your visual cortex as opposed to some other mode of it. So like dot and arrow diagrams in category theory are a notion of visualization. It's not making it geometric, right? You're not uh, saying, oh, let me represent what's going on with a particular space in some way. It's more just that you're being more flexible than what raw text as a data type would constrain you to. But you're still having something that you can process visually and use your visual intuitions for. Um, and so I think filling out that whole spectrum where there's some topics that lend themselves to geometry, and that's great, or some topics that lend themselves to being translated into geometry in some way that's like very, it scratches a niche and it's all beautiful. But even the topics that aren't doing that, there might be ways of being more clever with the notation. Like maybe a simpler example, rather than thinking category theory, if we go to like linear algebra, there's two senses in which we can think about visualizing matrix multiplication. So one of them is like the capital V visualization, authentic one, where you have a matrix and you're thinking of it as transforming space in some way, and like what it's doing in that sense. And there's a lot of good intuition to come from that. But then also there's just how are you actually thinking about the algorithm behind it and the numerical process of what numbers you're multiplying by which numbers. And you can maybe have a little dance going on in your head where you're picturing kind of taking these dot products of rows of one with columns of another. Or there's various things that people do where you might take one matrix and you take a matrix and put it on like the left of a square, and then take the other matrix and put it on the top of a square. And then everywhere where the column of one intersects with the row of another, that's starting to fill out the square. And that's like where your matrix product comes from. And these are both like leveraging the visual intuition in a certain way where you have a dance happening in your visual cortex as you're thinking about it. But they're doing it in very different ways, and they serve very different functions. One of them is solidifying the algorithm and what the numerical process is. The other one is solidifying the intuition for, like, in a coordinate free way, what the object as an action is doing. And so I think with any given topic, you probably have a whole spectrum of play that you can do to um, try to answer what it could be. Maybe we could actually be concrete in brainstorming here, Mira, where if there's a particular topic that you feel passionate about or that you have wanted it to do some exposition on, we can try to brainstorm like what is the dance that happens or that can happen like in someone's head that you can ignite by putting the right picture on the blackboard.
Well, I had this dream of making K-theory popular, algebraic K-theory. And I tried to make a series of short videos about it. I don't know how to visualize K-theory. I can tell you what K-theory is.
I guess there's two directions we could go. One is to what's the simplest, like most elementary example of something that you would describe as K theory, even if it's not being described with like the fully general abstract language? Like what's the most accessible example that you could start to hook someone in with?
Yes, so making natural numbers into integers is example of.
Okay, and then I guess in what sense is that K theory, or what's the like K theory part of that that you would highlight and want to point to someone? If you were talking to someone, you say this right here is a thing that can be generalized, and we're going to explore what outside of just like making things negative, like where else this process can happen.
Yeah, so I mean, basically what I explained in my videos, so I made a series where I think the first video was about explaining that this operation of adding negatives to a set with an operation can be done more generally. So I think that video went well. And then, so I tried to explain that in K-theory, you do this thing with vector bundles, so vector spaces in families. So that went fine. But already in the second video, I tried to explain that so now we can do this not just with a set with an operation, but also with a topological space with an operation. So do it in this already not on a set, not on a discrete level, but on this level of spaces. And so there is this like abstract way of taking a space with an operation and getting this space where operation has negatives in some sense. That video already had less views. And then the third video was saying, oh, and now we need to be able to, to actually define K-theory, we want to do this thing locally. So then define the concept of a sheaf, which is helps
Mhm.
you, if you know how to do something locally, then you can say that, oh, that's what we do. And that already had a few views.
Well, okay, several things. First of all, uh, you've said something here where you said that video had fewer views, as if that's the metric of success, which I don't know if that is the goal necessarily in your mind. You're saying, oh, I want a consistent level of views across all of them. Any series you make, anything that's sequential on the internet, there's going to be a drop off where the later ones have fewer views than the first one. That's how it works. Where people like start at one and then don't necessarily always go on to the others. In the same way that there's more people watching the first 3 seconds than there are watching the last 3 seconds. So the metrics of success shouldn't be constancy of views. It shouldn't even necessarily be views. But maybe what you want to be getting at is, did the lesson that you wanted to convey actually come through to people? And based on comments or based on what people wrote in, was there more or less confusion than you were hoping for? I think that's maybe the better metric to use. And then if the claim is, oh, once you got into describing this on topological spaces with an operation, if there's a belief that there was less understanding, not just that there were fewer views, but less understanding, then we can maybe unpack that. But you started by asking about visualization.
Wait,
I
wait,
think,
Grant. How do you measure success? What? So you're saying you try to judge by the comments on whether people understood what you were saying?
well, okay, so I'm being a little bit hypocritical because like it's impossible not to be given the analytics from YouTube and in some sense say like that did well. First of all, views are not what I care about. I think watch time, if you're going to choose any number, like looking at the time just makes more sense as a number. And secondly, I think there's this non-quantifiable, like vague notion of gratitude around certain topics that I can't put a number to it, but just from interactions with the audience in some way, I do have some feeling for. So I know that there's certain topics that like there's fewer maybe views, but there's more gratitude for. So like if I make a series, like I did a series about linear algebra many years ago, and then people have expressed a lot of gratitude, but the like later videos in that series, they're not the most viewed videos on the channel. But somehow if those later videos weren't made and it was less, as it is, it's not comprehensive. But if it was just like a random smattering of some videos, I don't think it would have the same gratitude. And so that that feels deeper and maybe like the attribute that I should be using in deciding on future content, more so than saying, hey, what's the most viewed thing that I've made and can I do more of that? In particular, because if you're focusing on that, you're always just going to be making like video number one of a series or something. You're never going to continue on because you do have this tail drop off where like once you're 6 chapters into something, there's never a reason to make the seventh chapter because you know you can get more views by just doing something, starting anew and fresh. But if that's how it works, then no one ever makes things that go beyond a certain depth on YouTube, which is kind of the situation, right? There's lots of introductions to lots of different topics, but then there's very few, like chapter 25 on a given topic.
That's so
Um,
interesting. I didn't think about it in this way, although it sounds very natural. And yes, you're of course right. But I guess what I tried to express is that I was hoping for more gratitude. And I think the
okay,
reason I
great.
didn't get enough is that I didn't make it visual enough or accessible enough. And so that's completely on me. But I wonder how you would try to make it better.
In this case, my first instinct is leveraging more very specific examples along the way. So, for example, when you're saying, oh, it could be a topological space with an operation. What space? Draw the space. Give me. It doesn't have to be like, you know, a statement about all of them. Like, what's a compelling, uh, simple enough but also generic enough, like actual space that you're drawing or you're representing in some way, and then what's the actual operation? Very often, what can happen with abstract math that's symbolically represented on a blackboard is that there's never any need to concretize it, like instantiate it, which is both very powerful because it means the statements you're making and the proofs you're doing aren't biased by the intuition that's maybe overfit on the particular example that you've drawn. So that's the benefit from the standpoint of rigor and proof. But it has the risk of losing people because a lot of the ways that we come to have a relationship with abstract topics is by having a population of concrete examples dancing around in our mind, such that the commonalities between those examples are what constitutes the abstraction itself, rather than, say, like the rigorous definition being the thing that constitutes that abstraction. So in this, I should watch the video to maybe judge it more directly, but um, I can give an example here. I made this video about topology way back when that was based on a very non-constructive proof. It's something like, oh, you have, like, in principle, such and such surface will exist. But because I'm in this style where I literally, there's something drawn for every moment that I'm talking, and I wanted to actually code it up, I found it was a intellectual challenge to say, like, oh, hang on, how do I parameterize the surface? Like, how do I represent it? What code am I writing that's going to render this? And then once I did it, like, something was drawn. I'm like, oh, I didn't know that's what it was going to look like. That element of surprise from the creator standpoint, where, like, I'd known abstractly how the argument worked, but I hadn't actually seen any specific examples of the, like, actual literal surfaces that it could apply to. That is a hallmark of concretizing something that I think will make it more helpful to viewers. And if there's not that, if the first instinct for how to represent it is to, like, have the symbol that's drawn on the blackboard where you're like, let T be such and such topological space with these properties, then you're not adding anything into the space of someone's mind. And so I think whatever the forcing function is that makes it so that you have to come up with a literal example that's being shown. In my case, it's like coding up the visuals and, like, got to code something. In your case, it might be something different. That maybe is a stepping stone towards making something. In this case, it's not just a matter of making it more visual, but making it empirical, making it something that people can let their mind, like, dwell on the data that you've offered them, and from that, draw their own abstractions and maybe relate a little bit more to the abstract statement once it's written on the board at the end of the lesson.
While you were talking, I actually thought through my videos and realized where it could be made much more visual than I have made it. So yes, in practice, I think believing that things could be made more visual is already a big help in doing it more visual. But maybe a related question, which I guess every person who is doing math outreach is somehow answering in every moment of their work, and I wonder how you do it for yourself, is how to strike the balance between accessibility and precision. And I think, at least in our part of math, it feels like, even in not even outreach in the big sense, just like even when people are giving a math talk in a conference, let's say, or seminar talk to researchers, I think people try to get more accessible by being less precise, but I think it's often that the speaker is already uncomfortable because it's not precise enough, but yet it's very far from being accessible. So it feels like there is such a huge gap.
I think the times where precision is at odds with accessibility are where it's adding too much cognitive load without the person really understanding why it's there in the first place. And so oftentimes it feels as if the way that a piece of math was defined is that you start off with, like, an attempt that's, like, simple, and you realize, like, oh, actually, that wouldn't account for such and such edge case. So you add a little caveat, or you refine it a little bit, and then you go and you're like, this isn't quite the right way because we see here. So you add another caveat, and you do this process many different times, and then the definition itself ends up more complicated than what the motivation was at the start. But that's the right definition, and so then when you go off to introduce it, you introduce logically. You go from what the definition is to what follows, rather than introducing it historically, which is like, what was the motivation, and then what caveats did we add thereafter. And logically, as if you're, like, writing a lean program or something, that makes total sense. You, like, start off with everything that's nice and clean, and then everything should just follow from it. But I always found that the most compelling books and the most compelling talks were the ones that were comfortable having something that was not correct, strictly speaking, like, early on, but then periodically refining and saying, here's why you need to, like, add this caveat, or here's why you need to, like, add this little bit. and where the definition feels like an ending point and not a starting point. And so I don't feel like that's being at odds with accessibility exactly, because it's the case that you can end up with the same level of precision by the end. It's more of a question of order of operations and whether you view a definition as the starting point or the ending point. Like, I think it should be viewed as completely okay to have theorems and examples even before you have the right definition there. And those theorems and examples are what helps um, justify what the ultimate definition is by the end, because that's what the process of discovery looks like. Like, you kind of know what you want to be true, you try to prove it, you realize that the reason you can't prove it is because like the definition wasn't what it was supposed to be, and so you like go back there. It's not as if like God handed you the correct definition for a topological space to begin, and then like all of topology like evolved thereafter. And good speakers and good writers are effective at doing this. In some ways, I think this is actually why single authored or like small number of authored pieces of exposition tend to do better than large number of authored pieces of exposition. If we contrast, for example, the Wikipedia page on a given math topic compared to if you open up like the Princeton Companion of Mathematics, like survey of that given topic, the Princeton one is just always going to be better. And I think it's related to the fact that you have a single author who is able to like construct the path that they want, where they're saying, here's the motivation, here's some examples for why this was, and they're telling a whole story over the course of the article. Whereas something like Wikipedia, that's maybe meant more as a reference, it's every given little subsection like should be precise. And also with the multiple author aspect, it's like if one person sees something, the easiest notion of correction is to say, here's the way in which it's not precise, as opposed to everyone having a synchronized notion of what the end-to-end narrative is supposed to be, and then critiquing how well it accomplishes that narrative. It's just hard to do in multiple minds. Same deal with like the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, just systematically having better articles describing something than like the Wikipedia page on a given philosophical topic. And part of that, I think, is just has everything to do with a willingness for individual sentences along the way to maybe say things that aren't it's not so much that they're imprecise as it is that they're like not yet correct. Like that it's a very uncomfortable thing to have in most pieces of like published work of some form. Like, oh, you can highlight this one paragraph and there's a way in which it's saying the thing that's like we have discovered is not quite the right definition.
That is so interesting. I always thought that wiki pages are lacking. Okay, if they're not great, I thought it's because you don't get much credit for writing a wiki page. Like, it's not written who has done it, so there is less motivation to do it well.
Though. They're like I shouldn't maybe say
sure.
they're not great for exposition. They're not great as an introduction, but like for what they're meant to do, they are great. But anyway, your point is that like you're not getting enough credit as the author, so you're not pouring yourself into it.
So I thought that's the reason. No, actually, I mean, to be fair, when I need to look up a math definition, first thing I check is a wiki page. So I'm not the one to blame them. But I thought that lack of recognized credit is the biggest obstruction to doing it better. And you think it's not that?
I've never gotten the impression that what Wikipedia editors are motivated by is credit. It's very funny.
I don't even know why people do that. Okay, can you maybe... I thought about this many times and I do not understand what's the motivation to spend your time on editing and writing wiki pages. Can someone tell me, please, how so many people have so much energy and motivation to do it?
Well, it's not that many people, I think, is one thing. Like, it's a very, very small percentage of users who do it. So I don't know. My loose impression is it's one that's kind of aesthetic based. Like, it just there's a level of, I don't know, cleanliness or organization. Surely you've had this where you've done some kind of project where you kind of just get addicted to the organization of it. So I'll have this sometimes in like code where I just like spend a week refactoring my like animation library in a way that I'm not making a new video. It didn't actually need to be refactored, but there's a certain like addiction to the aesthetic of doing it in a certain way. I think if people are cleaning their garage or cleaning their office, sometimes this happens where there's like you get started on one thing and you're like, there's a way that this can all be like quite perfect. I think that's maybe the emotion. Um, it
Wow.
it feels very academic of you to come at it from the side of credit. Like, oh, of course, people should be motivated by credit. Like in the world of academia, like that's the primary currency is one of
No,
credit.
it's not
Whereas
academic,
by
it's
contrast,
narcissistic.
there's a
Wait, Grant, I just thought that everyone
well,
needs to be praised for what they do to feel good about themselves. No?
I guess where I was going with it is like people in most of the rest of the economy, just like business or things like that, will often look at academia and be very confused by what motivates people. Where it's like not universally, but like a lot of people, it's just like they're not paid very well, and they're like, "Wow, you like pour all of your like notable talents and like notable energy into these things, and you're not really getting compensated for it." And the academic, they're like, "Well, no, that it's not literally just for like what money am I getting for publishing this paper? There's something else that comes. Part of it is internal satisfaction with like research and pushing forward human knowledge. I think a lot of it is also just credit is the currency. And so you've got like these different pockets of different people motivated by things in a way that makes it such that other pockets are just incomprehensible. So like the business people just can't understand the academics. Like the academics just can't understand the Wikipedia editors. It's like they're all just like playing with a different type of carrot. And that seems to be how the world works.
This question about Wikipedia has been bothering me for years, so I'm very happy that now I
I
have
don't
some
know the
answer.
answer. I'm just guessing.
It's more than I expect. I just had like complete not understanding. So, but okay, back to your work. So I think you have started answering this question, but maybe you could say something more. So I had an impression that one reason why people watch your videos or are curious about mathematics is that abstraction, up to some extent, is attractive to people. So there is something attractive or seducing in it. But then also when you tell people something too abstract, people very, very quickly lose interest, like within seconds. And so I wonder, is it somehow that like there is this maybe spectrum of abstraction and it's comfortable until some extent and uncomfortable otherwise, or there is something more interesting going on? And I'd like to hear how you think people perceive abstraction and whether the pleasure and discomfort of it, what's going on in your opinion?
I wouldn't have said that people have an attraction to what's abstract. I could be wrong, but first of all, maybe to be clear on terms, when I think of the word abstract, what I'm specifically thinking of is if you have like a general pattern among uh, some category of things. Like I think of a ladder of abstractions that like at its very earliest form, the first form of abstraction is numbers, where a child knows how to count and then they can like in principle like keep counting up. But then starting to represent numbers not with like a little set of dots or a little set of things, but with just a symbol is a form of abstraction. And it's powerful in the sense that then you can write down a number like 1287 and not have to look at 1287 things. So you have the sense that it's like compact, it's powerful, but it's the trade-off is it's slightly divorced from the thing that it's representing. And you have this risk that then when children are learning, the algorithm for multiplying numbers, they just go through the process and they're not even thinking about how it relates to actual counts of things. And then you have this happen at many different levels where the next big step for a lot of students is from arithmetic to algebra, where you have lots of patterns among numbers. And then suddenly you have a way of representing like a huge swath of patterns just with a small number of symbols by using some letters. Um, you're like factoring some expression like x squared minus y squared. Like that factoring is itself like a statement about a whole bunch of different numerical patterns, but like packaged into one. And so insofar as you're right and people are attracted to abstraction, maybe it's if they have a familiarity with how things can become both a lot simpler in the sense that there's lower information and also a lot more powerful in the sense that it applies to many more examples by finding the right new framing of it. And so that's like a satisfying ladder. And then where it loses people, I guess, is as soon as it's divorced from the underlying meaning. Like if you tried to teach someone algebra and they'd never learned about numbers, it just it's just like pointless symbolic play. Like maybe they like it as a weird form of game, like chess or something, where it's like, oh, I guess we've got these rules that determine when the symbols can like move around in certain ways. But if they had never known about numbers, it somehow carries no meaning. I think a lot of later abstract math, like if you start to try to describe um, like a topological space, even, I think uh, the there's one way that math expositors will go about it, which is to describe like this sort of rubber sheet geometry version on saying, oh, like it's, donut is the same thing as a coffee mug, or, surfaces are the same if you can morph one into the other without ever tearing it or gluing it together. It's just like this arbitrary set of rules that's maybe kind of fun to think about in this like mentally playful way. But the thing that it is abstracting um, is usually like this body of other problems within math, and the ways that topology is going to be most satisfying and most beautiful is to someone who's seen enough math that they know what the topological spaces are representing, rather than them just kind of being handed down as a primitive object with certain rules to deal with. And I don't have a good sense for whether people are attracted to just the game as it is. You just give the abstract rules and like, oh, they just kind of run with that. I know some people are are attracted to that, and those people have a tendency to go into abstract math. But I think most people they would need to see every rung of the ladder on the way up. And so whenever I'm making some kind of video, if there is an abstraction to it, this has been sort of the topic of the conversation leading up here and so far. I really try to make that something that comes towards the end, where the body of the video is filling out the specific one of the specific things which can be abstracted with a pattern later on. So then what hopefully happens is that you can spend the body of the video describing an actual problem, solving an actual problem in this very concrete setting, and looking at like a very specific thing as a typifying example. And then at the end, you can mention, like this is but one example in an infinite family that can be described elegantly with such and such symbols or something like that. And that you can leave someone with that feeling of like, oh wow, this can be very powerful. Like look at how compact it can become. But if you just open with that, I think for most people it's not actually like they're not attracted to that. They're not attracted to the abstraction in a naked way. They're only attracted to it insofar as it's compactifying something that was already inside their mind.
Oh, that's a great way to put it. I love this. I thought that people are attracted to abstraction because, I mean, every day someone asks me what I do in my life. And whenever I say that I do math, people get very curious. And I thought that curiosity comes from
I think something different is going on there.
what is going to tell me.
I think for a lot of people, when they think of math and they haven't gone into math, they just think of it as this like thing that's very hard that smart people do. And the curiosity comes from wondering like, what is it that the highest echelons of smart people like do? Like, because the way that it's presented in school, it's very sequential. It's like this class follows this class follows this class. And if you're very advanced, you go on this far. And it's like the infatuation that people will have with I don't know, like Einstein or people like that, where there's this or like relativity. It's not just it's not like, oh, I'm very curious about the nature of what happens when you're close to the speed of light. It's more just, wow, I like this is a thing that seems to be at some like upper echelon that like the really smart people are like thinking about. And that's like watching sports or something. You look at the world's best tennis player, and there's a certain attraction to like just knowing the boundary of like what humans do. And so if you say like you as a career do math, like my guess is that like, okay, it's the average conversation with someone off the street asking what you do, that this is where their mind is going. It's just like, oh wow, that was this thing that everyone views as hard, or many people view as hard in school. Some people seem really good at it. Some people like go on far with it. Just like, what is that? Like, what are you doing? What does that even entail? I think it's not obvious to a lot of people, and especially when it's got these lingering residues of competition in terms of how they view it, and like a certain competitive aspect for like students progressing faster. I could be wrong, but like I don't know. Does that jibe at all in terms of what you think people might be infatuated by?
Yeah, I also guess that the reason is the way like mathematicians are portrayed in media. It's usually like this genius sitting in a cave and proving a theorem on the stones around him. He usually has a white beard, which has, I think, not much to do with reality, at least nothing to do with my reality. Anyway, this relation between math and genius, which in the real everyday life of a mathematician is not nearly as close as it is in movies. Getting back to your work, I had a concrete question, or rather a specific question. So when you make a video, assume, although you tried to explain things very well and you did wonderfully your job of visualizing and everything, assume because of a person's background, they couldn't follow everything that you said in the video. So they have learned something, but also they couldn't understand some other parts. So is there something you could do to help them feel smart rather than stupid by the end of watching your video?
I think as much as it's possible to convey, like, it's okay not to understand it, or to convey that it's not on them if they didn't understand it, but it's on me, or it's on like a difference in background, and maybe trying to emphasize how the differentiating factor between someone understanding a topic and another person not isn't that that first person was like smarter, had a higher IQ, but it's because they had engaged with some sort of patterns or some sort of material that was similar to it up ahead of time. I don't know the best way to communicate that other than to just say it. Um, what do you think? What's the best way to communicate to people that not understanding a given lesson does not speak to their intelligence?
In the beginning of each of my K-theory videos, every time I say that a disclaimer, if you don't follow something, that's not on you, that's because I didn't explain it well. So I try
Oh,
to
that's
say
great.
this explicitly every time. But I do this because I think while in the ideal world, people would know that, oh, it's just their background is different. But in practice, my impression is that there is a ton of negative feelings associated to mathematics, in particular, not understanding mathematics. My impression is that it's not an inherent thing to mathematics, but somehow in the culture of humans, understanding mathematics is closely related to smartness. And so the opposite is also true, unfortunately.
Well, okay, I think maybe I don't know how to do this in like a single video, but maybe you could have topics that are centered around this where you unpack genius, where what I mean by that is like you'll have these things that people do that sometimes just look completely like, okay, the story of Ramanujan with the number 1789. The actual story is probably like been twisted and made apocryphal or something. I think the version I heard is that when he was in the hospital near the end of his life, like he was being visited by, maybe it was Hardy, maybe it was another mathematician, and he comes in, he's like, I noticed as I was driving here, the taxi cab in front of me had the license plate number 1729, and it struck me that this was a very unremarkable number. And supposedly, like immediately, Ramanujan says, it's very remarkable though, don't you see? This is the first number that can be expressed as the sum of two cubes in two different ways. On the one hand, it's 10 cubed plus 9 cubed, but on the other hand, it's 12 cubed plus 1 cubed. And it's the first such number that can be expressed as the sum of two cubes in two separate ways. And so this looks like bizarre genius, right? Like, who thinks of that? Like, who would like recognize that up front? And then like, how would you think of that ahead of time? Is it the case that this is someone who just like is constantly thinking about like random questions associated with integers and like adding them? No, I don't know actually how he would have found it, but I feel like there's a very plausible path to why that's not a wild thing for someone like Ramanujan to have like thought about before, where some of the math that he was doing is related to like modular forms where one of the coefficients is 12 cubed, and the number 12 cubed is just like present in the theory, and 12 cubed is 1728, and so that's like a number he would have engaged with maybe more than like the average cube of another number because it's like this coefficient in a certain common series. And if you're Ramanujan and you see 1728 and it's a cube, you might think, oh, that's kind of funny because you would maybe also know that 9 cubed is 729. And it's like not that unusual that someone who's like played with numbers in their youth like recognizes what 9 cubed is. And if you see 1728 and you think it's looks kind of like 729, and you realize, oh, it's one less than 9 cubed plus 1,000. And you're like, actually 1,000 is also a cube. So I guess we've got like 9 cubed plus 10 cubed, and that's the same as 12 cubed plus 1, which I guess is 12 cubed plus 1 cubed. Oh, I wonder, are there any other things where you can express it as the sum of two cubes in two different ways? Like there's maybe a not ridiculous reason why someone like him would have thought about that before. But then the appearance with the anecdote is just like it's this either a stroke of brilliance in the moment, or that it's like he's just thought about every possible thing out there before, such that he could say why any number is interesting. Um, but the more that you can do to kind of say these moments are functions of experience, they're not functions of like alien insight in that moment, or they're not functions of super rapid computation happening inside someone's brain in that moment. I think that can maybe make it a little bit more palatable for someone to not follow in a given lesson, or not feel, because they realize like, oh, those who do, it's built upon an assumption of certain past thoughts and certain past experiences. And maybe don't have that now, but like, hey, the only path to having that is to like get more exposure. In the same way that I think it's not uninspiring if someone starts speaking German and you're an English speaker to not understand what they're saying. You're like, oh, I would need to like spend many hours like learning German before I can understand this. It's not because I'm less smart or like I'm less fundamentally able to learn German. It's like obviously learning a language is going to take a lot. It's attainable. We all can do it. It's just going to take a lot of time. And I think maybe if somehow the same can be communicated of math, where you've got these things that it very subtly is as if someone just started speaking a different language because they're drawing on a different assumed background from the audience. That should be as palatable as if someone just switched from speaking English to speaking German in the middle of a sentence. Like in a very obvious way, that's on the speaker, that's not on the listener. But it's much less obvious in math because it's hard to tell maybe when they've switched to drawing on a different set of past experiences.
I think you're putting it in a great way. And indeed, this huge difference in psychology of how people think about math and languages is shown in the example that indeed people don't feel stupid if they don't know a language they haven't learned, but it's somehow very different with mathematics. Yeah, that's a great comparison. I wanted to ask, while you have all this understanding about learning languages and learning math, do you yourself have negative feelings associated to math, or like when you don't understand some math, do you experience frustration or something like that?
Oh yeah, obviously, yeah.
So how do you deal with those?
I mean, I guess there's just not in my life. There's not too much consequence to not understanding something. In that, like, okay, I don't get this thing yet, and like, if I need to, I can come back to it later. Um, Honestly, I think a lot of the negative feelings will come more from the idea that I like spend less and less time less time than I want to on actively learning new things. And I know that's a very important thing to do, and it's just something that is very easy when there's so many other things to do that kind of gets deprioritized um, in my life. And so more of the negative emotions will come around like, man, if I really did want to understand this new thing, I'm just not putting in the time that I would need to. And it's more of like a self-effacing uh, on like organizing my own life, rather than it being kind of like, oh, I could never understand this. When I was younger, like early college student, I would often just like take a book for what it was and like try to work my way through it. And then later would come to realize that some authors just resonate way better with me than others. And that a given book might not be working now, but after I like go to a different source and I come back to that book, then it'll make more sense. And spending a lot less time hammering my head on like one particular source, as opposed to saying like, no, this is poorly written, or it's not written for where I am now. Let me just like move on and do some other things. That that obviated a certain kind of frustration that there once was, where it's just like moving through mud to learn something new sometimes. And so I think sometimes I will get frustrated just where I'm reading something, I'm like, God, This could be so much better written. Like, why didn't you just like motivate your freaking definitions, or like tell me, give me one reason why I should care about this, or like don't wait until like chapter 5 before there's like a substantive result that I'm getting from like digesting all of these definitions. That's a kind of frustration where I think, especially as I've gotten more into math communication and like thinking about the way to structure explanations, there's just a certain frustration where it's like, you could guys, you could be doing so much better here. Like, would it kill you to draw a diagram of the obviously geometric thing that you're describing right now? Um, or things like that. So I think maybe my my frustrations have like shifted from being inward focused to outward focused over the years.
That helps.
It's all the more frustrating if you're like, why is this going to take like 200 hours when like with a better bit of exposition maybe it could have taken 40. um it's it's like a kid with a marshmallow or something. There's like I know that the marshmallow is there, just like let me have it. Like, why are you making this so hard?
Grant, I know that you're famous for your videos, but I have studied your website and I found a tab that I loved very much, and I recommend to everyone before you can complain about me recommending it. So I haven't watched all your videos, unfortunately, but I have read all your poems that you put on your website. And I love them. Oh my God. So let me quote one of them, and then so that I had as an excuse to ask you a question. Or rather, I needed an excuse to quote your poem.
Sure, sure. I can give you the context on those if you want. This was just like me as a senior in college, just like happily. I'm like, oh, this seems like a fun thing. And then it was the same time I was making the YouTube channel. So as I was making a website, I just like put that there. And even though it doesn't necessarily fit, it's just like kind of always been there because it felt weird to delete them.
I usually cannot relate to poetry in English or in other languages that are not my mother tongue because there is this distance. But I think I could feel more the uh, play of words in your poems, maybe because it's not just English, but also math, which is maybe more of a native tongue.
Or maybe because they're kind of childish.
Anyway, so there is this, in the end of the poem on prime numbers, you wrote,
Oh, well, for some reason, I feel compelled to say that the structure of this poem is that each pair of lines, the number of syllables is a prime number that like keeps growing. So that's why like the ones towards the end are more just like prose.
I know, my friend figured it out and we were very happy that he discovered it.
However, to recruit for and progress math, we need to have such questions which can be phrased simply and remain unsolved. What child does not hear such conjectures and dream, if only for a moment, that they will be the one to see them resolved? For otherwise, the once vigorous curiosity of a child towards math's patterns, as they grow older, tend to grow tame, just as the rhyme and rhythm of primes seems to fade as numbers grow, though in both the underlying patterns remain the same. Oh yeah, I do like that. I forgot.
See, told you.
Yeah.
It's wonderful. I love it. But I wanted to ask, is it true that grown-ups preserve child's belief that we might answer a simply formulated question in math? Like, don't we get used with time to those problems being unsolvable? And with that in mind, I was actually wondering how to popularize modern math because it's very often moves further away from those simple questions.
Right, 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 right. Um, yeah, okay. I mean, it's like, what's the function of an unsolved problem? And so, in some ways, like the really charming thing about the prime number ones is that at the very least, you can communicate that there are unsolved problems, right? Which even a lot of
Mm.
people outside of math, they just don't think of it
Mm.
that way. They're like, what do mathematicians do? Just like multiply really big numbers? Like, why don't you have computers do it? Or there's like certain questions like that are asked that reveal it's like, oh, you just don't know what's going on. Okay, like maybe I can try to like try to explain what math actually is. And so accessible questions serve that function. And like the fact that most unsolved problems aren't understandable, like that's not a problem because their function isn't an expositional one. Their function is not to pull people into the field. Their function is to push forward the field. And like expertise takes time, and this is how it works with any field, not just math, but the things that are at the forefront of the field are just not understandable to someone who hasn't been well educated all the way up to it. So I don't think that's a problem with the nature of like more modern math or other kinds of problems, because if if all you want is the ones that can inspire the child to dream that they might be the ones to do it. Yeah, we've got the handful. It's fine. You've got 3n+1. You've got the prime number ones. If anything, you don't want to have too many because then, like, you don't want the ambitious math students to waste their time trying to solve unsolved problems in a way that'll be unproductive. So, like, maybe don't give too many of them. Um, and much better, actually, like much more productive, would be to think about how can you have the problems which are really good scaffolding for problem solving that a child can have the experience of solving for themselves. So I think competition problems serve this function well, partly because there's just a huge catalog of like competition problems out there, and they tend to be like pretty good problems. And also, I don't love competition math in the sense of having a notion of timed experiences where you end up with this ranking, but having the like status of the International Math Olympiad or something like that surrounding a given problem at the very least ignites someone's interest in a similar way to what unsolved problems do, where you have this feeling that like, ah, this is what someone who's like really smart would do. And you can use that to your advantage when you're trying to inspire people into the field. Like one of the most popular videos I made, I think it was called The Hardest Problem on the Hardest Test, because it was describing like problem 6 on some Putnam. Now it's like there have been harder problems on the Putnam for sure, but being able to frame it in that way, it's like, hey, this is a famously hard test, and like this problem was showing up at like positioned as the hardest one on that. The compelling thing is then to say not just like, hey, look at this hard problem in the same way that you can say, look at the twin prime conjecture. The compelling thing is to then say, and here's how you could imagine like solving it yourself. Here's the path of thought that you might be able to go through such that not just someone, but like you could come to it. Having that as a collection of problems seems like it would be very, very productive for math outreach. All of the ones that you can give a compelling framing for why like they are hard. So, contest problems have this because you can just say, how did people do on it? Like, you got a lot of smart people that took this. We measured it. Like, how many people answered it? So you can quantify the sense in which it's hard, but then to still give someone the experience of what it's like to solve it, um, partly just to build the muscles and partly to build the confidence. That seems like where people should be spending their time thinking, rather than saying like, oh, how can we make the you know the Millennium Prize problems more understandable or something like that.
I see. Yes, that yeah, you're right. Is there something you'd like to ask mathematicians about?
Why or under what circumstances would it make sense for more pure mathematicians to work in less pure contexts, collaborating with people in adjacent departments? Kind of akin to everything that was happening in like Bell Labs or in the Manhattan Project, or situations like this through history, where you take people who would be inclined for very pure research and you throw them in an environment that requires highly practical outcomes. It seems like this is healthy for progress. Both in terms of keeping abstract math grounded, so it's like healthy for the math, and then also that it takes some of the like talented problem solvers and ensures that they're they're working on technology in addition to theory. Um, I would like to basically one test the extent to which my instinct that would be productive is true. Like it might be the case, but like, no, the kind of problem solving tactics that go into pure math, they're actually pretty useless for techno. Like we wouldn't be that helpful. Like that might be an answer. Which I would actually believe maybe a lot of mathematicians wouldn't be helpful, but some of them would. And then secondly, just you know, how do you make that happen? What's the best way to make that happen in some pragmatic sense? Because there's enough stories of people who were in pure math, but just like engaged with adjacent fields and did something different and like changed that field entirely, that it seems like low hanging fruit for getting more human progress.
Yeah, you're right. That's a great question. Um, I want to leave it as an open question because I didn't plan to answer it. I was just curious what you're thinking about. Let me ask you the last question. So I know you have given a lot of wonderful advice on how to do math outreach. Is there any advice in math outreach that you have not given in your videos?
Teach. Most people in math probably are doing this anyway in some form or another, but like don't just write talks or write blog posts or like make videos. This is, I will say, at the moment, like this moment in my life, a hypocritical piece of advice that I'm trying to change. But like, make sure that there's some component of like the hours in your week that go towards actually teaching actual people in some setting, such that you remain a little bit grounded on what motivates, what topics are hard, what topics are easy, all of this. Like don't let yourself accidentally just float into the realm of uh, like public intellectual, like purely thinking in terms of your own head and like spewing out stuff, but keep it grounded.
I see. Thank you so much, Grant, and thank you so much for your time and all your wonderful thoughts.
It was a pleasure. Yeah, thanks for having me on.